Welcome, and thank you for joining us for History at High Noon, the fate of Raleigh's 11 missing freedmen's villages. My name is Stacy, and I handle adult education here at the museum, and we're so glad that you're joining us for today's lunchtime lecture program. History at High Noon is just one of many exciting digital offerings available through MOH as part of our History at Home initiative. So if you'd like to learn more, we invite you to head over to the museum's website at www.ncmuseumofhistory.org. Before we get started, we would like to take this opportunity to thank our North Carolina Museum of History Associates and Foundation for making today's program possible. Our associates and foundation provide crucial funding and support to the museum, which, in addition to many other things, helps make programs like today's program happen. If you'd like to learn more about becoming an associates member, we invite you to head over to their website at www.ncmoha.com. We would also like to take this opportunity to thank those of you who graciously donated funds towards today's program. We do our best to keep our programming free to attend, but there are costs associated with keeping these series going, and we continue to be so humbled by your generous support of the museum and its programming. A few housekeeping tips for today. We ask that you please keep your mics muted throughout the entirety of the program, and to please type any questions that you have for our speakers into the chat function located at the bottom center of your screen. At the end of the talk, I will ask the speakers as many of your questions as time allows. All right, so it is my honor to introduce today's speakers, Heather Leah, multimedia journalist, and Carmen Kothman, writer, editor, and historian. Leah is a fifth-generation Raleighite whose passion is exploring lost and hidden history. She has served as an editor-in-chief for local news and entertainment blog Candid Slice since 2012 and covers a hidden history beat for WRAL.com after having done so previously at ABC 11. Kothman was responsible for writing, editing, proofreading, and indexing the official journal of the North Carolina House of Representatives for more than 19 years. She now shares Raleigh's Black history through detailed posts at her research and resource blog. All right, Heather, I believe that you're going to lead us off, so I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all so much for being here today. It is wonderful to see how many people are interested in this history and excited to learn about it. So originally, this sort of got kicked off with the museum reaching out and saying they'd really love to do a talk on an article that I'd written for WRAL. And if you've lived in Raleigh long enough, you really kind of are aware that there are lots of districts in Raleigh, right? There's the Warehouse District, there's North Raleigh, there's Midtown, which is where North Hills is now. But a lot of people aren't really aware that there are entire neighborhoods and districts and parts of Raleigh that just don't really exist anymore. Places that you'll find on older maps, but you won't really find any mention of today. And so I love to play this game with myself where I stand in one part of Raleigh and I think to myself, what was in this exact spot 50 years ago? What was here 100 years ago, 200 years ago? I like to go back to like 500 years ago if I can. And it will really tell you a lot about the history of the city when you have a really good understanding of what was standing here when the city was built or even before. And a lot of times you'll find some interesting surprises. So there are entire neighborhoods that have virtually been erased from history. In fact, there's entire universities that were in Raleigh that have been erased from history. And when I say erased from history, I mean there's no more structure left standing. It's been torn down, demolished, and really, it's not really talked about in many history books. It's something that you would really have to work to find, and that's hidden history. And so I have done a lot of research into freedmen's villages. Now, a freedmen's village, for those of you who don't know, probably a lot of you do, but just to very briefly explain it, a freedmen's village, I remember asking a historian for the city of Raleigh when it came to the Cameron plantation, right? Because the Cameron plantation was one of the larger plantations in the area, really in the state. And I asked him, and he had hundreds of people who were enslaved on that plantation, which stood around abouts where Cameron, or I guess the village district, stands today. So I asked, what happened in the immediate aftermath? You know, you hear there was emancipation, people were free, And then you don't typically hear about what happened after that. You've just got hundreds of people who are now free, but they don't have jobs, they don't have money, they don't have homes, they don't have medical care and hospitals. You had hundreds of people who were free that now have to build their own society and get jobs and build skills. And within one generation, a lot of these people who I asked, what did they do in the immediate moment when they were freed? And he told me most of them ran off the plantation because they were just so excited to be able to. But a lot of them then returned to the plantation to work, and they worked as sharecroppers, and they would get paid, but paid very small amount for their work. And that was sort of the beginning. And also a lot of people will take Oberlin Village, for example. The plantation owner actually would have sold some of his land to form these communities where people could now live. Other landowners would do the same thing. They would sell parcels of land, and what would happen is these newly freed communities would form together because they would be able to work together to better pool money, build houses together, build churches together. And like I said, within one generation, there would be, in like Oberlin Village, we would have had churches built, we would have had Latta University built, St. Agnes Hospital was built, Shaw University was built. There was actually a time of thriving where these communities really started, at least some of these communities really started to be able to get involved in government for a time. And then eventually those types of things were oppressed once again to make sure that that kind of thriving would not continue. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, the city was flooded with about 4,000 newly freed people or freedmen. And so about 50%, and I'm sure Carmen will talk about this too, but about 50% of Raleigh's population was African American. So it was half of the population. And so you got to imagine there had to be space for these people to live. And they formed freedmen's villages. And there were 13 of them. Now, I've written a lot about Oberlin Village, which is still standing today, historic Oberlin, right there off Oberlin Road in that area. There's, Oberlin Village. And then there's also historic Method. And some of you have probably been to Method Park and Method Community Center and seen the Method neighborhood as well. Those were two of the larger ones, but there were 11 others. And I noticed as I began to do research into Oberlin and Method and what these people were doing when they got freed, I noticed I never heard of the other 11. Like, I didn't even know their names. And I started asking other historians if they knew, well, what were the other 11? What happened to them? Like, we know Oberlin and we know Method, and we have a lot of history on those. Although Oberlin itself has, at one point was just cut in half by Wade Avenue. And I know Carmen will talk about that too, just cut in half by Wade Avenue. And a lot of historic Oberlin, a lot of that history was also demolished, though much of it has been saved. And there are people working on preserving that history and those stories. But there were 11 others. What happened to them? Are they just gone? Did they turn into other neighborhoods? And we're going to find out what really happened to these other 11 freedmen's villages, where people were pulling together, people who had been freed recently from slavery were pulling together to build homes and schools, churches and hospitals and medical care. And all of these things would have existed as people built these freedmen's villages. And yet most people don't even know the names or where they even stood. They're just kind of gone. I know Stacy should have a photo. Stacy?
Yes.
Just to give you guys a quick visual, and then I would like to turn it over to Carmen, because she is the person that, as I started to do this research and really couldn't find much information, there's one document that was written in 1985 about the freedmen's villages, and it does have a lot of great information, but Google is sort of the great keeper of information nowadays for a lot of people. Obviously there are books, but a lot of people use the internet for their research. And written in 1985, it wouldn't have been SEO friendly, and it doesn't really float to the top. So if you were to Google freedmen's villages in Raleigh, you're not really going to find the information you need. And that's one way that history gets lost, is it's just written and kept in a location that people no longer use as much, such as older documents that you'd really have to know how to find. Are we frozen on the screen? I don't see a picture coming up.
Which picture you want?
Oh, okay, gotcha. Let's do Bloodworth Home and Bloodworth Home 2. We'll do both of those to start.
Bloodworth Home.
So these are two homes. I wanted to give you guys a very quick visual, and Carmen will have some too. But of sort of what the homes in these neighborhoods would have looked like, to understand what a freedman's village would have looked like. Now, one thing you can do is drive through Oberlin and Method today to get a general idea of what a freedman's village would have looked like. But a lot of those historic houses, some of them were torn down, and also some of them are very large and more kind of like Dr. Pope's house. It was a more upper middle class level home, and it really depended on what freedman's village you would have lived in, right? But there are some homes that are on Bloodworth that are in a historically Black neighborhood, and they were built in the 1800s. And so I wanted to take a look at those. I don't see them pulling up. Is there an issue?
Nope. So these are the two Bloodworth that I have. Bloodworth Home was that one.
Okay. Yeah.
Are you able to see them on my screen? Make sure.
All I see is the files listed. I don't see a picture.
It should be pulling up. Let's see.
It pulled up at one point and then it went back to hiding.
Yes, and Bell says the pictures are not showing.
Yeah.
There we go. All right, so this one was built more around the turn of the century, but I do think it gives you a decent idea of what some of these homes might have looked like, the size and the kind of, again, homes that are in historically Black neighborhoods. Now, I do believe that this is one of the homes that is slated to be demolished soon. We do have some homes on Bloodworth Street that are going to be torn down that are historic, and they're historically Black homes in a historically Black neighborhood. And then we have the other one that I believe the next one is the one that was built in the 1850s.
Let me see if I can.
So I think this one is really interesting looking.
And that is a shotgun home.
It is. Thank you, Carmen. Okay. So this is a great example of what a shotgun home would look like. And that's unfortunate then. I believe that it's one that's being torn down. I would need to double check the exact address, but I'm like 95% sure that that's one of them that's being torn down. Carmen, do you have any insight? I know you said you, when you were growing up, you spent a lot of time on Bloodworth. Do you have any insight onto who would have lived in that area?
I believe that the house that we just looked at was beside, I think this is the 800 block.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that was beside where the old Exxon station was, which has been torn down. Cynthia, you're right. If that second picture has not popped up.
Yeah.
But this was, I think, before the Planning Commission yesterday.
There it is.
That's the second house, and it has been modernized. You can tell. The house to the left, actually those houses are across the street from each other.
They are. Yes, they are.
And this is part of the gentrification process, but in this particular instance, I believe the developer has made a I can't think of the word I want to use, but one of the agreements in their rezoning is that the three houses that are still standing will be offered to the public for free if they will move them. And that was on yesterday's Planning Commission. And I don't know what the outcome of the vote was, but there is a time limit when the houses will be available to be moved. The developer will not pay for any of the cost. And so those houses can be saved because they are considered affordable housing at this point. And we are losing our affordable housing. What's going to be built there is homes that are in the $500,000 price range. My grandmother lived a block down the street. So I spent a lot of time on Bloodworth Street when I was growing up. And even her house is gone at this point. So
And
Heather,
Carmen, you hit it on the head. It's what happened to the 11 Freedmen's Villages, gentrification. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, because Carmen is who I went to with these questions, and she's been researching this for years. Other than that 1985 document, this is your source on this information. So
thank you. So let's not hold it long at all. Stacy, if you want to go ahead and put up the slideshow or my presentation. And while that's coming up, I just want to tell you, we got an email from Sabrina Good, who is the director of the Friends of Oberlin Village. And I live in Oberlin now. I've lived here for 30 years in Oberlin. I've been in Raleigh since 1959. I was born at St. Agnes. But Ruth Little, who is an amazing historian here in Raleigh, is going to be doing a reading this coming Sunday at 3 o'clock, talking about her research for Oberlin. And what they have now found is that Oberlin was not a freedmen's village. It was founded by free Blacks. The property was sold, and I'll tell a little bit of history. So this is Oberlin's the only Black settlement that we know of in Wake County and probably the state that was started by free Blacks on a former plantation. So let me just start here with this first slide. To the right is the Mordecai Plantation. So the Camerons owned the largest plantation east of the Mississippi. They owned over 30,000 acres of land and over 1,000 slaves. So this house was part of the plantation that was gifted to one of the Cameron, one of the daughters. If you know anything about Stagville, Stagville was part of the Cameron plantation, and it was the Benahan house. And so when their daughter married Duncan Cameron, they were given this plot of land, and this house was built there. And so that tells you, if you ever go to Mordecai and you go inside the visitor center, there is a map. And when I saw the map, this is probably 3 or 4 years ago, on the wall, and it showed that Oberlin was part of the estate, the plantation. I was flabbergasted because I was like, that's huge. I had no idea that their plantation, their land was 30,000 acres and as far over as Alabama and Mississippi. So this was a very wealthy family. And we don't think about that all the time. Let's skip over to the next slide. So the house on the bottom right is the Cameron's Stagville plantation home, the Benahan Cameron house. And the picture on the left is part of the slave quarters. So I just want you to have that visual and think also in terms of the middle of Wake County to Durham County was part of this one plantation. And so Oberlin was begun by freemen. The land originally was selling for $4 or $5, a lot. When Blacks began to buy, the price shot up to $50-some a lot or an acre. And so part of the push of Friends of Oberlin Village has been to change the name of things that are along Oberlin Road that have been named Cameron, because it really has been a slap in the face to know that all of that area was part of a plantation. And Oberlin, in fact, Joe Holt says Oberlin community, they knew they couldn't cross over to that area and spend time as he was growing up. And that's, 70, 80 years ago. Okay, let's skip to the next slide. So there are patterns. There were patterns established in Raleigh and probably in most cities. So the city of Raleigh was started in 1792 and the boundaries were established in a 1 mile radius. So you are still today crossing North, South, East, and West Street. And in the research, I'm finding that Raleigh was crisscrossed by creeks and watersheds, and the high hills, long ridges, and dank bottoms characterized Raleigh's terrain. And so the plantation owners didn't want to live down in the bottom where it was wet. So they chose the higher sites to live on. And the low-lying areas were either for industrial development or they stayed vacant. After the Civil War, after slavery ended, freedmen who came into Raleigh, those were the pieces of land that they were allowed to buy or rent, those vacant, dank, wet areas. And it was the less expensive land, obviously. So that's where Black people settled after slavery, is east of East Street and south of South Street. And so those were where the Black majorities were allowed to live. And as we go through this presentation, you will see that that's why Raleigh is somewhat segregated today. And I think from what I have been reading about other cities and towns across the country, it is the same in every area. This map comes from a book that I have used for research quite a bit. It's called The Urban Negro in the South. It was written by Dr. Wilma Carter, who was a professor at Shaw University. She wrote it in 1961, and it is still a recent, even though the book is out of print. Some of those book companies that reprint old books, that's the only place you can find a copy of this book now. The title, I have a bibliography at the end. I see this question popping up. I have a bibliography at the end of the presentation, so you will be able to get all of that there. All right, let's go to the next slide. So I want to talk real quickly what kind of jobs were available right after slavery. The term Negro jobs meant they were menial or low-paying jobs. So there was unskilled labor, mill and railroad labor, domestic service, or road gang employment. If you had, you were able to purchase your freedom, or you were free Black, you could build trades and build an economic security for yourself. You could become a barber, a drayman, which is, carrying stuff, carpenters, brick masons, stone cutters, harness makers, things that people were able to, or did on the plantation. They were able to translate those into economic security for some group of people. And even when people were slaves, sometimes they were hired out to other plantations to do work, and the plantation owner might allow the slave to have some of the money that they got paid. That was not often, but that did occur sometimes. So after slavery ended, Blacks were interspersed among whites throughout the city, but free Blacks wanted to live where people who looked like them were. They didn't want to continue to live with their slave owners. Some did because they didn't know anything better and they didn't have any money. Let's see. So we were clustered around the city, generally occupying the cheaper tracts of land, and in areas where there was economic advancement, Black leaders and middle class grew, and so did churches, schools, and larger homes. So by the 1890s, 50% of Raleigh's population was Black, and mature and solidly segregated neighborhoods encircled the city because they were outside of the city limits. And white people considered that it was racial claustrophobia, and that's in quotes because I got that out of some personal interviews. And they felt like the city was under siege by this masses, what they considered masses of Black and brown people, or darkies as they would call them, who were coming in to take over. And so let's go on to the next slide. So as I'm sharing these things with you, I want you to understand when we talk about systemic racism, this is where the foundation comes from. So Raleigh, and I'll talk about this a little bit in a later slide, had some differences that a lot of cities didn't have, in the fact that there were two colleges, Black colleges started on either end of the city, St. Aug by the Episcopal Church, and Shaw by the Tuppers, and named later after Shaw. So these schools, as people came to school and graduated, they would build their neighborhoods around the schools. So we have different kinds of growth in the city. So by the 1890s, we had two wards that were predominantly Black. That was 2nd and 4th Ward. They included the city's graded schools. There were two of those, 6 Black churches, Shaw University, the Colored Masonic Hall, and the Institute for the Colored, Deaf, Dumb, and Blind. And the segregated areas that were outside of the city limits, which were the Freedmen's Villages, and were called that because they were started in most part by the Freedmen's Bureaus. There were 2 offices set up here in Raleigh. They were called suburbs. And the leaders, the political leaders here in town, they didn't want the Black people here. And so they always talked about the moral climate of the neighborhoods, and didn't think that, it was good anything. Not considering that it can't be good if the things that you are putting in place for the white people, you are not putting in place for the Black people. And there were still white laborers who lived in those areas, but that was because they were poor. And generally, as they were able to grow their finances, they would move out of the Black neighborhoods. Let's go on to the next slide. So we've talked about the land at the bottom of the where it was wet were places that were considered unfit for whites to live. And these areas were near contaminated streams from waste, or slaughterhouses, or flour mills, or industrial sites, or close to the cemeteries. And the cemeteries had drainage and they smelled bad. We weren't embalming people like we are today. And a lot of times the areas where people lived were in alleys. So there is still a Stronach's Alley in downtown Raleigh. If you know where the Pope House is, you turn off of Wilmington Street. It looks like a driveway. It's really an alley. It's a street. There was a warehouse that Stronach owned, and that's another historic district here in Raleigh. But these alleys would be behind businesses or hotels, or in former slave quarters that were behind residences. And it was also because these places needed staff on site all the time. So they were filthy, they were narrow, they had open sewers, and they were breeding grounds of disease and crime. And one research book says they were areas only fit for cattle, but that is where Black people were living. These caused high mortality rates. Streetcar service didn't run there. They didn't have street lights. They didn't have fire protection. It was substandard living. However, if you had to have somewhere to live, then you lived there. And sometimes your housing for your whole family was a room as opposed to a house or an apartment. One of the ways that was considered to control the Black population was to annex an area because of unsanitary conditions or lawlessness. And so that would bring in a segregated community that was ringing, one of the suburbs that was ringing the city. And so more institutions would be built around, and that continued the pattern of segregation. And Oberlin was not part of the city, and it was one of the areas that was high up off of the dank areas. So we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. Next slide, please. So this is a black and white housing pattern map from 1886 that I found in a book called Race Relations in the Urban South. And you can see where the black lines are. Those streets were 90% or more black. So you can see where the segregation in the city had already begun. So you'll see the little white boxes or clear looking boxes, those were white public schools. The black boxes are black schools. The crosses, the black ones are black churches. The clear crosses are white churches. And this was just an interesting map to me. It was the first time I had seen it when I was doing my deep dive. Let's go to the next slide, please. So I've already said that half the population was black by the 1890s. There was a third ward that was also black in between 1868 and 1901. Blacks were very involved and very active during the Reconstruction period in terms of governing the city. And that was also part of the reason that Reconstruction ended. In some of my research, I found that when there was a city ordinance that required that there be black magistrates and police officers, the white governing leadership didn't like that because they didn't want black people telling them what to do. So that was, part of the beginning of the end. Let's go to the next page. So this is a little bit of information from Dr. Carter's book. And she talks again about the educational institutions. So Shaw University had the first medical school in the country for blacks. It was a 4-year medical school. And so as people, generally men graduated from Shaw's medical school, they stayed here and set up their practices. Shaw also had a pharmacy school and a law school. They started a dental school, but that did not take off the ground. So you can see that because professionals were being graduated from these schools, yes, this was a perfect area for, once you got your degree, to just stay here and set up your practice. Dr. Carter said when it came to where people lived, Negroes and whites bought and lived in the same areas. Wherever they saw land, they wanted it, could pay for it, they got it. And that was one of the interviews. And if you get a chance to get this book, it is such fascinating reading because her interviews, some of them have names, and there would be names that you would know. You would know the Lightner family. You may have heard of the Taylor family, the Kays. And then some, and there are tons of personal interviews, and she wrote this in 1961. So it's really not that far back. And so to be, a 50-year-old book, but to have interviews with people and hear street names and information that is still here today, and the fact that she wrote it right here, and it's, it's a historian's like treasure chest. I think you would enjoy it. So look for it. Next slide. Okay, so Heather's going to jump in with me here. So this is a map from a 1985 master's thesis of Carl Larson. This is in the back of his research. So there's like 100 and some pages of typing. And then, woo, lo and behold, there was this map and it had names on it. And it was like, it's like freedom. So his work is called A Separate Reality: The Development of Racial Segregation in Raleigh, North Carolina from 1865 to 1915. And he lists the 13 Black settlements. They are not all on the map. 9 of them are. Actually, all 9 of them are not, but we'll talk about them. And I have even delved so far as to take that map and color code it and determine what the boundary streets are as of today, so that if you're driving around in Raleigh, or if you even live in some of these areas, you will know what they are. So we'll start with the 4 that were before Reconstruction that are not on the map. So Lincolnville was in West Raleigh, and I originally thought it was on Highway 54. That's what I told Leah, because there's a Lincolnville AME church there, and I know that's in a Black neighborhood. I was doing some more research 2 weeks ago and found that Lincolnville was actually over near where Carter Finley Stadium was. And so while I had read that Lincolnville disappeared because the state bought the property, I didn't realize that that's where it was. So the church that was left, the original Lincolnville church, was taken down and moved to the state fair and was part of the Village of Yesteryear. Brooklyn was an area near Devereaux Farm and St. Aug. And so that's, pretty close to what we consider Smoky Hollow, which is Peace Street area. For those of you who, if you come off of Peace Street, if you come off of Downtown Boulevard or Capitol Boulevard onto Peace Street to the area where it used to be the trash trucks sat, was Devereaux. That was actually Devereaux Meadows. When I was growing up, that was a ballpark. So Devereaux Farm was in that area. So somewhere between there and St. Aug was Brooklyn. Masonville became Method, which is still with us today, and Oberlin, which is actually was from Glenwood Avenue all the way over to Hillsborough Street. And it got smaller and smaller as people began to sell their land. And then urban renewal, which is one of my least favorite parts of America as well, came through to build a highway, which is Wade Avenue. So Wade Avenue cut right down the middle of what was left of Oberlin. So these 9 freedmen's villages were built during Reconstruction. Hungry Neck, which is, it says it's down the hill from the Capitol. So here's the boundaries for Hungry Neck, from New Bern Avenue to Jones Street to North Swain Street to Edenton Street. So all of that area that says Hungry Neck that's the area for that. St. Petersburg, which is down under 2 areas underneath Hungry Neck, goes from Hargett Street to Camden Street to Davie Street to East Street. Cotton Place and Idlewild. So I believe it was Mr. Cotton who owned this plantation. And after slavery, it was divided by New Bern Avenue. So Cotton Place is from Camden Street to Cotton Street to East Hargett Street to South State Street. So if you are familiar with where the DMV is on New Bern Avenue, there's a little neighborhood right behind. So before you get to the DMV, there is a state employees credit union. So behind the credit union is Cotton Place, and it's a very small neighborhood. Then we look at the old fairground area, which is across Hargett Street from Cotton Place. So that was actually the original fairgrounds. And then the fairgrounds moved to where the Raleigh Little Theater is today, and then moved from there to where it sits now. So old fairground area was from Camden Street to Hargett Street to State Street to Davie Street. I'm really familiar with these areas because my father and his parents and his grandparents lived on Camden Street. We just sold that house probably in the last 10 years. So we had a family piece of property on Camden Street, and my godmothers lived on Cotton Place. So this is all old home stuff for me, and it's really exciting when you delve into your own history and you find real history. So the next area is Hayti, which is not pictured on the map. If you look at the bottom of the map on the left-hand side, where it says Watson's Addition, back where Washington School is the Hayti area. And there is a street there that is called, or it used to be a street there called Hayti. Cannon Lands is also not pictured on this map. So for these last few, when Heather and I get to the next set of slides, we'll be showing you where these places are today and what they look like today. So Cannon Lands is not pictured on the map. It is near, and it was part of the Cannon Farm. It's near the railroad tracks in near where Washington School is. Manley Homestead is also not on the map, but it is also near the railroad tracks. Smith Haywood area is quite a large area. And if you look at the size of the lots, the streets, it was a more prosperous area. If you look at Idlewild and across, or the area that's not named there, those are larger areas. And I want to say, these are the areas that are the boundaries between St. Aug at the top of the map and Shaw University at the bottom of the map. So these are the areas where, as people would graduate and begin professional work or jobs out of college and had that education, these were probably the more upper middle class areas. The Smith Haywood area goes from Lenore, it starts at Lenore, and you'll see where Lenore is right above where it says Watson Addition at the bottom of the map. So Smith Haywood starts at the corner of Lenore and East, goes over to Davies Street, comes down to Tarboro Road and Rock Quarry right there at their intersection, comes back over to Lenore Street and goes back up. And then Wilmington Blunt is not pictured on the map, but that is the other area. And Wilmington Street, from the Capitol down, was actually before Hargett Street became Black Main Street in Raleigh. Wilmington Street was actually more of Black Main Street. Most of the barbers and restaurants were there and were run by Black families. Next slide, please. Okay, Heather, jump on in.
Yeah, so when we're talking about where these places are today, after my article came out and people were they all wanted to figure out where these locations were based on the names. So Lincolnville, obviously this is, we originally had thought it was somewhere else, which it's probably still in my article. Oh no, I would have changed it after you emailed me. But you can see here that Lincolnville the land was taken to become part of NCSU. Interesting. So when you're walking on NC State University campus today, I'm assuming you would be walking on what was Lincolnville in parts of it.
Actually, it's over the part over where Carter Finley Stadium is.
That makes sense.
So not really, but so when you're in the parking lot, tailgating, you're tailgating in Lincolnville.
Wow. See, to me, that's the most fun, is to figure out where you are today and to realize what it used to be.
Right.
Was it named Lincolnville because I've seen there's a lot of Lincoln related titles. There's the Lincoln Theater, which is near Stronach Alley,
right.
And Lincolnville.
I don't know, but I would assume it was because President Lincoln freed the slaves.
That makes sense.
That would be my assumption. We didn't know quite how he felt so much about slavery until later, but
at the time, yeah,
he did what he did. So Black people were happy. Okay, next slide. So Method. Method was one of the original freedmen's villages and was annexed and is still standing today. Quite a few of the homes and things have been torn down, but this yellow highlighted area is Method. It goes from Borough Road and kind of Hillsborough Street over to, it actually went further. It went probably over to Western Boulevard, but as NC State, eminent domain takes stuff when the state and the government want it, they get it. But that's the area today that is considered method.
And with Method, one of the nice things about Method and Oberlin is you can go visit. And I tell people to go to the Method Park, because when you go there, you're actually on the land. I didn't know this for a long time. So, I learned this stuff as I write about it, right? The Method Park is actually on the Barry O'Kelly School campus. So the buildings at Method are actually, they're the school. They saved some of the school buildings. And so you're actually in this original structure that was the Barry O'Kelly School, which at the time, was, remind me, it's slipping my mind. What kind of Rosenwald? It was a Rosenwald.
Rosenwald School. And someone just sent me pictures of Rosenwald and other officials this morning at the Barry O'Kelly School. So there will be more going up on my blog about that. So
yeah, you can actually go see part of Method and the school that the students in Method would have attended for quite a while.
Right. Okay, next slide. This is talking about Oberlin, and this is some quotes out of the Urban Negro in the South. Oberlin used to be a colored community. For those of you who are too young to know, Black people went from darkies to colored to Negro to Black to African American to people of color. And I remember we had the hardest time getting my grandmother to not call us colored. We hated that. But Oberlin used to be a colored community. Whites lived around the outskirts of Oberlin, but they were poor whites. Everything was Negro. And because of that, nobody bothered about us. The city would fix up the streets or give us lights or anything else. In 1916, there wasn't a white person on any of the property. Then whites began to pay high prices for the property. Then they tried to run the Negroes out. Later, it was incorporated as part of the city. And now not 1/8 of Oberlin is colored. That was the most desirable property in Raleigh, for it overlooks Raleigh. Whites paid them, the Negroes, good money for it. That's why they sold it. One fellow got $50,000 for his property. And this excited the Negroes because they hadn't been used to paying over $4,000 to $5,000 for housing. And I live in Oberlin today. I've been here 30 years. When I moved in, it was an all Black neighborhood. And we rented our house for 10 years. We bought it, and we couldn't afford to buy a house here today. The prices of homes in our area, I think we paid $65,000 for our house, and still we're struggling to pay the mortgage. And the houses that are being built around me now are $500,000 and up. So and there's maybe only 10 Black families still living in Oberlin. So I was telling Heather before we started the broadcast, when I was growing up, we didn't call it Oberlin, we called it West Raleigh, because this was like the outer bounds of Raleigh. Okay, next slide.
I wanted to say on Oberlin real quick, I had spoken to Friends of Oberlin when I was writing a story about Oberlin Village. And the name Oberlin, which a lot of people know the story that it came from the college in Ohio, which was an abolitionist college in Ohio. And so they would have chosen that name because of what it represented to them, this uplifting of the oppressed. But I actually found out the college was named after a man in France who had founded an orphanage and tried to help people, orphan children, way before the college was even created. So the name Oberlin goes back hundreds of years, but has always represented this, at least in this name Oberlin, has always represented the uplifting of the oppressed and this idea of freedom, which is part of why it would have been such a slap in the face that, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, that this land, which they had, claimed and worked for and built up as Oberlin, this uplifting the oppressed, is then renamed for the original plantation owner who did oppress them. And the same people are still living there, or at least the people living there, some of their ancestors might have been actively oppressed by this name. So when we're talking about the name change, this is where the name Oberlin really originated and had a lot of power. So it's wonderful to keep that name alive.
So I I used a city map, as I told you earlier, to use to show where things were today. So Oberlin, I don't know that it was this wide, but Oberlin Road is a curvy road. So that's why the swath of yellow is so wide. So to look from Hillsborough Street to Glenwood Avenue, that's a long, long path. So that was the original Oberlin Village area, was along that road. Next slide. So my arrows have disappeared here. And I want to, when I said earlier, I hated urban renewal, this is part of why I hated urban renewal. These streets that you see on this map do not really exist any longer. For those of you who have been in Raleigh for years, when I was growing up, I was born in 1959. There was a bustling, large Black neighborhood. If you have ever driven down Fayetteville Street past Memorial Auditorium, it looks kind of empty. But when I was growing up, all of that was houses, churches, businesses. That was the Black neighborhood in Raleigh. And so you can see the area under where it says Cannon. There's, I don't know why the arrows don't want to show up. But under that area is the Cannon Freedman, where the Cannon Freedmen's Village was. Manley, if you look down a little beyond Midway, there is a line with a 50 on it in a circle. Manley Street is there. That street no longer exists. Hayti it crosses Manley, and all of this is coming off of Fayetteville Road. But these were three other freedmen's villages, and you'll notice the crossed line, that is the railroad tracks. So those people probably they settled near the railroad because that's where their jobs were. And railroad jobs were good paying jobs for people who had come out of slavery and didn't have a lot of other skills. So if they could work on the railroad, they could make really good living. So a lot of that area there was mixed, Black and white, because railroad jobs were good and allowed you to make money and not just be hand to mouth. Okay, next page. Nazareth was not one of the freedmen's villages, but the land was purchased by the Pope family in the 1880s. And it was next to the Catholic diocese and it's still there. So you'll see WRAL TV Gardens and Studio. And so when you, and some of that area has been changed, but right in that area, if you come down beside WRAL, that is Nazareth. And that was another Black neighborhood. And I threw that in because a lot of people don't know that that was a Black neighborhood. And it was full of houses when I was growing up. Next slide, please.
I didn't know that either. And I've been in that area doing the history of the orphanage that was there.
Yeah.
Wow, that's great.
Okay, so these two maps are showing the change in the Manley and Hayti areas between 1945 and 1961. And this was part of the urban renewal. So you can see on the left-hand side of the street is the earlier map. And you'll see that dark Black line down the middle divides the two maps. So you'll see that Wilmington Street came down and curved. And then if you look at the 1961 map, it was straightened. So urban renewal had already started at that point. It was not completed. So where Martin Luther King Boulevard comes into Western Boulevard, all of that was done in the late 60s, early 70s. So people had to move. And I don't think I have slides in here of where people went, but if you have heard of Rochester Heights or Biltmore Hills, which are further in South Raleigh, and Biltmore, I mean, Rochester Heights actually is on the National Historic Register. So a lot of people moved out of that area and were able to buy homes or rent homes that were built. John Winters developed those areas. He was our first Black state senator from Wake County. And so, and he also built Madonna Acres. So there was quite a bit of building going on in Black neighborhoods, but I just wanted to share that with you because I think it's important to see not just the Freedmen's Villages, but progress forward and 2 steps back. Next slide, please. So by 1910, Idlewild was all Black. Smoky Hollow, which had been a mixed community of mill workers, was becoming less mixed. And if you look on the Sanborn insurance maps, Black housing is often listed as Negro shanties or tenements. You know, it didn't matter how they looked. It just mattered that they were people who were brown and Black, and they weren't white. And so it was always a derogatory name given to show the difference between the white housing and the Black housing. And that's part of redlining as well, but it was, you know, it was a little different. This is really before like FHA redlining and that kind of thing came into play. And sometimes, you know, we talked a little bit about this with the alleyways. Workers needed to live near their places of employment. They didn't have access to streetcars. The streetcars weren't going in that direction. So they had to have somewhere to live. And so oftentimes they were given space to live in the rear of the property. And the Black elites, as they're titled in some books, lived on streets near their colleges, the public schools, or the churches that employed them. Next slide. And I just want to show you some of the housing just to illustrate the houses. If you'll notice, these houses are built on stilts. The houses are built on stilts so that the water, when the water is running downhill, doesn't get in the house. And you think about that, that's extra added expense, that's extra, that's extra stress, emotional stress to have to consider that you got to build your house up on a stilt because this is the only land you're able to buy. And some of these are shotgun houses, and this is Raleigh property. Some of these, the upper right hand, I believe, is near is where Walnut Terrace is now. And I cannot remember exactly where the other pictures are, but most of these came from Cultural Resources or archives or the Raleigh Housing Authority website.
Are any of these still standing today, or is there a place where someone could see shotgun houses today if they wanted to go look?
Shotgun houses are still standing on Oakwood Avenue across from the cemetery. They're bright colored now. They are, and the reason for those who don't know, the reason they're called shotgun houses is because there's a door in the front, there's a door in the back, and it said that you could shoot a gun from the front door and the bullet would go straight out the back door and you wouldn't hit anything. And it's been learned in the last, I guess, 10 or 12 years that while shotgun houses were really built and it came out of the New Orleans area because they were reminiscent of the Yoruba houses and tribes in West Africa. So that was new because a lot of the political leaders did not want shotgun houses to stay. They wanted those torn down because they only saw it. We didn't know all of the history of those houses and what they were based on, and all we would see or would think about was, these were houses for poor people who didn't have anything, and this was not history to celebrate.
I wanted to just say, I see some people logging off because we're at 1 o'clock. For those of you, I know we're going over. I do have a map to show of like today's map, like a map of Google today, where some of these places are on the map in modern times. Just so you guys know, as I know it's 1 o'clock and we're starting to log off.
And really quickly, for my blog is, if you go to www.researchandresource.com, it's a blog called Raleigh Black History. And I will be uploading this presentation later on today. You can sign up for the blog because there are a couple of different things that go out each week. And I would love to have you share there. And if you get this presentation, it will have a bibliography on the end. The name of the book again is The Urban Negro in the South by Dr. Wilmus A. Carter. Here, let me throw in the chat.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Let me throw in the chat the name of the website.
I also wanted to say, since I know some of you are logging off, we do on WRAL Hidden History, I do a hidden history story every weekend. So if you ever have any ideas or you want to see something covered on WRAL Hidden History, please let me know. My email is hleah@wral.com, HLEAH@wral.com. And if you do a search for WRAL Hidden History in Google, the whole series will pop up. There's dozens and dozens of stories already. I've done stories on Devereaux Meadow, like Carmen mentioned, the old baseball stadium, which there are remnants of the baseball stadium still there today if you go look. I've done stories on Freedmen's Villages, a lot of stories on Oberlin, Method, and I also usually do a live stream where I go explore what's left of it today and show you what it looks like now. So for example, I went to Devereaux Meadow and looked at the remnants of the baseball stadium, or I explored the Raleigh Speedway, which was a NASCAR speedway, and there are pieces of it still out there in the woods today. I went to St. Agnes and was allowed to walk around inside of the structure that is remaining of St. Agnes. So, I mean, I've done stories on highways that are no longer in use, abandoned highways that go off into lakes and communities that are underneath the lake. So if you like hidden history, definitely check out WRAL Hidden History. Every weekend I put up something new. I just did a story on Pullen Park and the history of where the carousel came from. And then next weekend, I'm actually doing a history of Friendship, which is a community near Apex, which was an integrated community before integration was really the norm, when things were still very segregated. So WRAL Hidden History, and then Carmen, I know you want to remind them about yours as well again, because people are asking.
Right, and I threw that in the chat. If we go real quick through these last, I think there's 3 more slides.
And then I have a map as well.
So this is not the best map, but this is Smoky Hollow. This is a map of Smoky Hollow before it was cleaned up, and that was part of urban renewal as well. 165 families were moved out of Smoky Hollow when urban renewal came through. Next slide. And this is the 4th Ward neighborhood in yellow here. That was also destroyed through urban renewal. We talked about that. So that highlighted area for today would be from the Red Hat Amphitheater over to where the McDowell Salisbury connector runs. Next slide. So this is kind of a heat map of racial density from 2000. So the blue dots are where Black people lived in 2000. So you see the segregation in the city, and you see where it has come from. So that this is part of why we have to dig into our history, because we don't know what's out there just looking from where we are today. Next slide. Here's the bibliography. These are the books and research papers that I used. And my understanding is that this has been recorded and it will be on the Museum of History's YouTube channel. I don't know how quickly it will get there, but that is what we were told. Heather, you got any more? If you'll
do.
skip over 2 slides and that would be where my other information is, and I have put it in the chat. It's the Museum of History's YouTube channel. It's hard to see the questions when they pop up in the chat. You go on over to the next slide. If you all want to take a picture of that with your phone, that'll give you that information as well. And both Heather and I have put our information in the chat. And if you don't know that you can do this, there are 3 buttons on the right-hand side of the bottom of the chat. You can click on that and you can save the chat to your computer or your phone. So, Stacy, I guess we're throwing it back to you.
Okay, like give me just 1 second. I was going to get Heather's map up so you guys can.
Okay, good.
Yes, and I did want to remind people too, those houses that we showed in the beginning that are going to be torn down. If anybody has interest in, if you know an organization that could help preserve those houses or move those houses, that is, as Carmen said, that's affordable housing, and it's Black history. And it's another piece of, you know, Black history and historically Black neighborhoods that's going to be wiped out and gone unless someone will save it. And that's exactly how we've lost this history again and again, how we've lost these homes. And not only is it the structure, but we're also talking about the people. You know, if you move out the people, then the history goes with them. It's not just about saving the building. So this is one of the issues with gentrification that we deal with in Raleigh. And I'm not saying that Raleigh shouldn't grow. I don't think Carmen or I feel that way. But there's a way to do it sensitively and just with more mindfulness and care, so that we're protecting the history and protecting the people who have really lived here. You know, some of these people have lived here, they're 3rd or 4th generation Raleighites, and then they're being forced to leave their homes due to either not being able to afford the neighborhood anymore or it being, you know, developed over. I had one more thing I'd wanted to show. It is the maps. Let's see. I can't really see the links very well. Leadworth, House. Try the IMG 3591.
Okay, just 1 second.
Oh no, try Hungry Neck. Click that one, please.
Okay. Just 1 second.
So for some people had been wondering where these places existed today. And after speaking with Carmen, there was so much information that she gave me about the names of the places that I was able to go and I looked on Google and actually found that some of these names do still exist. You can still find them on Raleigh maps. I don't know why the images have trouble opening. But if you go to Google Maps and you do a search for like Idlewild or Cotton Place or Hungry Neck, some of these places that we have found out are the names, here we go, that we have found out are the names of these freedmen's villages. Unless you knew the names, you would never be able to put 2 and 2 together. But there actually is a place right there off New Bern Avenue in Edenton called Hungry Neck North. And then beneath it, there's a place called Cotton Place. And then there's another map that I have in there, but you can go and look and you'll find a street called Idlewild Avenue. There's also a street called, I believe it's Freeman Street, which is right there near that. And then of course the old fairgrounds are also still marked by these sidewalk markers. And that's the other thing. There are these interesting sidewalk markers. There's several of them. There's a series of them and you walk over them every day and probably don't even realize it. Would you like to try opening the one you're hovering over? There we go. Now this is actually a picture Carmen took, but I was very excited about it. there's a marker right there that you probably walk over and maybe not even realize how important this piece of history is that you're walking through. So there is a marker for the Idlewild neighborhood, and there's also a marker just like this for the old fairgrounds right there by the DMV. I must have driven past it a million times and not even known. So I just wanted to point that out so you can see where these places stood historically, but you can also see that while the structures are gone and a lot of the history isn't as prominently spoken about anymore, there are tiny shreds, tiny reminders as the names have turned into street names or sidewalk markers or neighborhood names. Carmen, tell me if I'm wrong. I know there is an area off Glenwood, which is where the Devereaux plantation house stood. That area is referred to as Brooklyn even today, by some of the people who lived there.
I don't know that.
Oh,
That's-
really?
That's new to me.
Yeah, they called it Brooklyn, and I didn't know why. I was like, that's a weird thing to call this neighborhood in Raleigh. And it's actually where the Devereaux plantation house stood, and also right there by Fred Fletcher Park, which is where Will's Forest, there's a road called Will's Forest, and Will's Forest is based on a legend of Will, who was a free Black man who lived in the woods back there because the Devereaux family was allowing him and I think his brother or his friend to live back there. They had found him, as the legend goes, they had found them after a ship crash in Wilmington, and they didn't really know what to do with them. And they weren't enslaved by anyone, so they were considered to be free. And the Devereaux family and the Lane family ended up allowing them to live on their property in the woods. And there's these whole accounts of it by family members who write about going down to see Daddy Will in the 1800s. And even today, there's a street named Will's Forest, and you wouldn't realize where these street names come from. So I just wanted to point that out. There are places today where you can go and stand where these freedmen's villages once were, and where you can see where some of these names are still around in Raleigh. But if you don't know the history, you won't know what to connect them with. I would have never known what Hungry Neck was, or why Brooklyn was called that. So I wanted to show you guys that so you could really see where some of these places are today and why it's become hidden history, because you're standing on Idlewild Avenue and have no clue that that's referring to this whole village where all these people lived and worked, and then their homes and history were lost and built over and gentrified. So there is that today.
Yeah,
that's pretty much it on my end too.
I want to thank you both so much for such a wonderful, wonderful talk today. We are out of time, everybody. I apologize, but as both Carmen and Heather alluded to, you can easily reach them by email, either through Carmen's blog or through WRAL for Heather. We thank you all so much for joining us today. Again, this has been recorded and it will be available on the museum's YouTube channel, usually posted within a week of the actual event, so within a week of today's program. And we just want to say thank you all so much again. And we hope that you will join us for next month's History at High Noon program. And stay safe, be well, and we will see you all soon. Take care, everyone.